Chapter 14 Jagiello Arrives. A door had shut not only on Jadwiga's girlhood, it had shut on the south. Her star of destiny pointed north. Twice as far away as Buda, about 500 miles northeast of Krakow, in a land of rolling hills and inland waters, lay the Lithuanian capital, the sprawling, low-roofed city of Vilnius. It was a city of wood and terror of the torch, which, brandished by pagans of the still precariously held province of Samogitia, or by retaliating Tatars or Poles or covetous Germans, had so often turned the low clustering settlement into a holocaust. Vilnius's royal buildings were grouped about a courtyard on land between the Vilja River, which was spanned by bridges built by slaves and serfs, and the sacred wood. They included the wooden chateau whose gardens ran to the river, accessory houses, a watchtower from which hot tar and boiling water could be poured on a near enemy, and the pagan sanctuary with its perpetual flame. The stables housed thousands of horses, following 14th century custom. Lithuanian Grand Dukes set a second, better protected chateau on one of the three small sandy hills just beyond the lower enclosure. This, because of its irregularities, was known as Crooked House. From its generously proportioned hall, decorated with knives and animal heads, furs and embroideries, they looked off across heavily forested lands, dotted with lakes, blue in summer and grandly white in winter. A brick fortress topped each of the two neighboring hillocks. These ducal strongholds were surrounded by customary moat and wall, but a series of outrunning ridges furnished more protection than walls. The capital spread far out from the royal enclosure and the sacred wood with its holy oaks and serpents. As in Krakow, Castle Street connected Wawel Hill with the marketplace. So here in Vilnius, Long Road ran from the chateau to the heart of the city. It was bordered by many small wooden shops, and dignified by a few brick buildings. Long Road led on to a second capital, the important lakeside city of Troki, about 20 miles west of Vilnius. Its typical wooden house was rudely constructed. Its main feature, a huge fireplace built behind a low brick wall in the corner of the living room. A cauldron hung over the fire, and often a cradle hung from another hook in the ceiling. A hole in the low thatched roof served as smoke vent, and a stretched bladder skin as window, if there was one. People slept on the floor on rugs or straw, and in winter housed their animals in a compartment next to their own. There, too, were kept stores of meat and apples, beets, and essential hay and grains. Yet no matter how rude the dwelling, it was apt to have an accompanying grace of honeysuckle and hop vine, or was surrounded by lily and rue plots. The chateau was set on a miniature hill rising beside the lake shore. Its carpets and embroideries rich in oriental colorings and motifs, and the gold and silver ornaments that mingled with the spoils of war and chase, witnessed to the wealth of Duke Kestutis, whose particular property this had been. It was now claimed by his son, Prince Vytautas, who was destined to become the hero of the new century. Already in Vytautas's face shone a dream. In their youth, small, lithe Vytautas and his more solidly built cousin, Jagiello, had been often together at Troki, where they must have discussed Vytautas' plans for a palace in the new Gothic style to be built on the tree-embowered island in the lake. When not at war, they hunted wolves and boar and buffalo, almost literally living in their saddles. But this close cousinly relationship was violently broken by the fatal struggle between the powerful Jagiello and his uncle over the inheritance of Algirdas's rights and possessions. Kestutis lost, for Jagiello, after having called him to a conference, had him strangled. How successfully the Knights of the Cross had fanned the flame of this fire, no one quite knew, but many were convinced that they had a hand in every evil action. To strengthen their hold on faraway Dnieper River plains, other Grand Dukes besides Jagiello's father, Algirdas, had married Ruthenian princesses, who brought to Lithuania the civilization of the East and made Ruthenian the court language. Jagiello's mother, Juliana, adored her seventh dark-haired, dark-eyed, lucky son, Some said to the extent of spoiling him. At any rate, she gave him a sound body. He was of medium height and strongly set up, and she pushed in every way she could the development of his inherited capacities. But Lithuanian Ruthenian culture was not Western culture. The Lithuanian people as a whole were still pagan, shackled by the evils of slavery and polygamy. Therefore, Europe had long prayed for the success of the German knights in their crusades. Had the original ambition of these soldiers to win the heathen to Christ not succumbed to the ambition to add Lithuanian territories to that Prussia for which they were laying the foundation, they might have succeeded in converting this pagan people. Lithuania was ripe for conversion. Franciscan missionaries, who braved death and met it, had probably done more than any others in preparing the soil for its Christian harvest. Wooden crosses on a hill beyond Jagiello's chateau at Vilnius testified to their martyrdom. During the 13th century, every ruler of Europe had aspired, as King Louis and Duke Albert had, to share with the White Capes at least one crusade against the northern infidel. But now, toward the close of the century, the curious Baltic theocracy was so absorbed in secular pursuits that it was the object of fierce denunciation, even within the church itself. Saint Bridget of Sweden was not the only holy person to attack it with voice and pen of flame. Yet everyone admitted that the order had been a civilizing influence. Its members had reclaimed the swamps and wastes of the Prussian coastal lands, developed agriculture and trade, founded cities. Companies of knights numbering thousands still came from Christian lands to visit Marienburg, if only to see the lifting red brick walls and spires, and the halls rich in stained glass and sculpture and patterned marble floors, and to enjoy the stores of the wine cellars and warehouses and gardens, which supplemented those the heavily freighted wagons brought daily to its gates. Without these gates was a supporting city, and within them were military training quarters, agricultural and other schools, and a great variety of workshops and mills. The White Capes were famous for their archery, and their falcons, often presented as tokens of regard, were coveted throughout Europe. From this center of science and learning, they went forth on their mission, now primarily one of conquest of Lithuanian territory. How quickening to the imagination were the fantastically far-flung, mobile boundaries of Lithuania. Ethnically small, the country had grown until it reached far and vague steppes, over which moved immense human tides. In the lowest type of Lithuanian, this picture stimulated brute warrior covetousness. In the highest, in Prince Vytautas, for instance, it awoke a dream of aggrandizement, yes, but also a dream of himself as a bringer of civilization to heathen peoples. His histrionic eye saw himself in the role of beneficent arbiter of these yet unstabilized, ferocious eastern hordes. His cousin Jagiello did not thus dream. He was jealous of his father's gains and eager to increase them. And in the division of power among the brothers, tenacious of his own position of leadership. And something deeper was stirring in him. He was looking westward rather than eastward. Little did that West suspect him of statesmanlike thoughts. The Germans had effectively painted him before Europe's eyes as the hairy wolf, the bloodthirsty Saracen of the north. So Europe and Jadwiga believed him to be. Directly north of Jagiello's capital at Riga was another order, less powerful than that of the Teutonic Knights, and it is reported that its leader was one of the first to urge Jagiello to consider the enormous political advantages of union with Poland, and why, he asked, with the Hungarian princess now crowned at Krakow, should the Grand Duke through this union not win the most beautiful woman in the earth's circle as bride? Simultaneously, the Poles were asking a similar question. One of the inexorable great moments of history had arrived. It demanded of a young girl that she become its servant. So negotiations had begun. The Treaty of Crevaux was signed. Assurances were given. Then Jagiello prepared to make the great journey. And soon with most of his brothers, among them Skirgailo, Boris and Korigailo, Svidrigailo, and Vigund, with his cousin Prince Vytautas, and a great company of other princes and boyars, and many treasure wagons. He passed between the flanking, shaggy-haired multitudes shouting their goodbyes, out from the capital and on toward Troki. He traveled south to Lublin, where he halted cautiously several days, and where his long friendship with the Castilian Comita was founded. From Lublin he proceeded slowly and grandly to Sandomir, each day joined by more Polish nobles. None were more eager to go to meet Jagiello than were the men of Poland's army, which included not only the great nobles, but all landowners, the clergy alone being allowed to send substitutes. Each wanted to be the first to see this prospective commander-in-chief, whose fighting qualities were known far beyond Europe. To the Lithuanian and his party, the goal seemed now assured, yet they were keeping a watchful eye on Zamovit. From the day when she shut her lover out of her life, Jadwiga became only the Christian queen. Once, however, a chronicler reports, the curiosity of the daughter of Eve spoke again. Jagiello was approaching the city. Was he indeed as hideous as the Germans reported him? She sent for Zawisza of Olesnica, a knight known for his veracity, and charged him, on the pretext of complimenting Jagiello, to go to meet him, to accept no gifts, and to return quickly to report his impressions. Zawisza could make a good report. The pagan, though short of stature, was not ill-appearing. His face was longish, his hair black, his rather small eyes brilliantly dark, his teeth shining white. His skin was wind-browned because of warring adventures on the steppes, and also because of his passion for the hunt. His voice was low, his speech rapid. Far from being the hairy savage Christians had pictured, he had on the whole a gentle expression, and on this occasion at least, princely manners. It appears that Jagiello, suspecting the knight's mission, had received him with much courtesy, and probably not without amusement, invited him to accompany him to the bath. Zawisza's report greatly reassured Jadwiga, but the red words, pagan wolf, scourge, murderer, burned in on her girl's brain, could not be quickly erased. Priests and princes had been striving to erase them, but with little success. If she looked to Hungary for the rescue, she saw, with anxiety, such dark clouds of threatening catastrophe closing over her mother and Mary, that she knew she could expect little help from them. In despairing moments did she again stand with William beside the Danube, as together they watched its dark current, rushing onward. With what terrible clarity Scribe John's words, as he interpreted for her St. Margaret's renunciation, words at the time rather vague, must have sounded in her ears. But had not St. Margaret, after all, had the favored part? Would it not be easier to flee to the shelter and quiet of a convent, back to the nuns of St. Clara or St. Margaret, than to remain crowned and sceptered where she was? To face what? As she asked the desperate questions, she met her father's answering, reassuring look. Had he but lived, how different things would have been. Yet he was looking down on her. Then in self-forgetfulness, she would turn her thoughts to her unfortunate mother and sister. But the struggle began again. No one had yet convinced her that this man coming to take William's place had not at least instigated the murder of his uncle, Kestutis. Nor could she forget that her father and William's uncle, Duke Albert, counted among her holiest achievements their crusades against this outcast ruler. Jagiello might be outwardly changed, but how could he be within? She fled again to her chapel and the Blessed Virgin, and to courage-renewing thoughts of the intrepid saints, Bridget and Catherine. The greater part of the Diet went to meet the Grand Duke, who approached for the first time not to destroy, but to build. They forgot desolate Jadwiga, forgot everything except the fact that the dreaded Jagiello was coming to them in peace. They watched his shining cavalcade as if it were somehow miraculously tracing a line of demarcation, shutting off forever past years of fire and sword. Of all Jagiello's retinue, his gifted cousin, Prince Vytautas, most excited their curiosity. Vytautas was vivid, active, abstemious in food and drink, though indulgent of other appetites, altogether a fascinating personality. The presence of this son of the murdered Kestutis witnessed strongly in the suitor's favor. On Monday, February 12th, 1386, as Jagiello entered Krakow, the populace hailed him as their deliverer from the nightmare of ever-threatening invasion. But he heard little, saw little, in his eagerness to be brought at last face to face with the woman who was the light of this new day beginning for himself and his people. He proceeded, escorted by a group of Polish seigneurs, to Wawel Hill. There was hurrying to and fro in Jadwiga's apartment, as dames and maidens of honor made ready for the reception of the bridegroom. Had this day but come a month earlier, and the preparations been for the handsome young Prince William, they would have been singing since dawn. Their poor queen, a man more than twice her age, and not of her world, a rough pagan. But they must not give way to these thoughts. He was coming, and he was the bridegroom. Jadwiga herself superintended details. She welcomed activity. The night had brought her little sleep, but she was determined to fail in nothing. The gate that had been barred against the man her father had chosen was now swung wide to the man others had chosen. Music filled the courtyard as he approached. But she had given her word. When the Lithuanian Grand Duke was presented, he would find her calm. And so he found her. She took her place on the throne, at one side of which stood Duke Władysław of Opeln, and at the other Duke Zamość of Mazovia. The assembled Polish nobles, searching her face, read on the fine forehead and in the sad eyes only dignity and control. They knew that they could depend on her. Then all eyes turned to Jagiello, advancing now toward the throne. He was clad in a long, straight robe of green velvet, with gold buttons, embroidered down the front with gold, and held by a magnificently wrought red and gold belt which matched his scabbard. His red velvet cape, too, was gold embroidered and furred with ermine. His steps were well timed, yet one suspected in him a certain swiftness and nervousness of temperament. On his long, smooth-shaven face and in his small, dark eyes shone an intensity of emotion. Looking up, he saw beauty that surpassed all that reports had painted. He dropped to his knees before the girl queen, and she, looking at him, felt that she need not fear this man. Fortunately, Jadwiga had little time to think much beyond that. The day following the presentation, Jagiello sent his brothers Skiergailo and Boris to the castle with magnificent gifts of gold and silver and oriental tissues. At court, in the church, in the council, there was a tumult of activity. The speed of the program then launched outran even our vaunted present-day pace. Only 3 days after his arrival, the Lithuanian fulfilled the first of his promises. With ceremonies whose import shook the Christian world, the ruler of the fire worshippers was baptized in Krakow Cathedral by Archbishop Bodzanta of Gniezno, along with his relatives and a large number of boyars, the Duke of Opeln standing as his godfather. He took the title of Władysław II, while his brother, Korygailo, became Casimir, Svidrigailo Boleslas, Wigunt Alexander, and others received similarly historic names. Relatives and followers already baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church held to that faith and kept their old names. What emotion in Christian Krakow! The influences that would flow from this baptism was incalculable. By it, the order became an anachronism. Yet there in the north, its tower still rose. What was to be their future? A territory stretching from the Baltic toward the Black Sea, and eastward almost to Moscow, would now turn its face to the west, toward Rome, and Occidental culture. Some were already calling Jagiello a second Constantine. With grim humor, he had invited Zollner, master of the thwarted order, to act as his godfather. But difficulties of travel prevented Zollner from accepting.